How bad was the Great Depression?
Pretty bad. My parents were school-aged children during that time, and it greatly impacted their lives. They lived in rural Iowa. Most people were farmers. My mom's grandfather has been the county attorney and probably the only attorney in the county. He was relatively prosperous, owning enough land to give each of his sons a piece of land to work. My granddad worked the dairy. All that, save the family homestead, went back to the banks once the Depression hit. My great-grandfather suffered a stroke and died a few years later. My maternal grandfather fed his family by bounty hunting coyotes and by trapping an occasional mink. My paternal grandfather was steadily employed as a lineman for the electrical utility. Not rich by any means, but able to get by. According to my parents, in the Depression everyone was poor, it was just a matter of degree. Many of their schoolmates were malnourished, some with no shoes to wear until snowfall. They all tired of eating beans. Many young men experienced their first indoor plumbing and 3 square meals a day when they joined the military, the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Works Progress Administration. You can tell how the Great Depression influenced the values of that generation. My parents hated to throw anything out that could be put to use later on, especially food. They were always frugal and lived within their means.
In a word, the Great Depression was horrific. At its depths, the number of the unemployed was about 25% of the population. Imagine walking down the street and every 4th house has a family with no income and knowing perfectly well they will soon lose their home. And the other 3 houses have families in fear of losing their jobs and perfectly willing to accept lower wages for longer hours in order to keep the job they had. Imagine everything you had spent your adult life accumulating. All your money. All your investments. Your home. Everything, simply gone. You did nothing wrong, no one stole anything from you. Everything simply evaporated in a flash. You had worked hard all your life and done your best to provide for yourself and your family, and now, through no fault of your own, you have to put your children to bed hungry. It is worth noting that virtually all of the regulations many feel are so burdensome were crafted by people who lived through the Depression or by their children. I submit they did that because they knew firsthand how destructive the Depression was and were determined that it should not happen again.
Was the Great Depression exaggerated?
I don't believe the Great Depression in the US is exaggerated. Aside from the rich tapestry of newspapers and magazines, photos, and film from that era, many of us in the US have family stories galore from that era. Here are some of mine. Number 1. My grandma took washing in for $1/4 a load. I don't believe these were little loads. Although in today's dollars that's about $4 or $5, and $5 is more than nothing, that's not much money for hours of work. My grandma had a washing machine. A drum with an agitator inside where you could actually see the clothes spinning, and where you then wrung the clothes out between rollers. It looked rather like this. Number 2. My aunt, my dad's sister, traveled with my grandpa in the 1940s. My grandpa had been a construction foreman and had helped build the Lincoln Tower, Fort Wayne's only skyscraper, for decades. Here's that building. When construction dried up, and it had been quite dry for a while, and World War II had started, my grandpa became sort of a traveling tradesman. Aunt was gone, but from what I remember, they traveled around, she with him, and my grandpa offered some sort of services, perhaps building Quonset huts or civilian building projects or whatnot. He and she showed up one day and asked around for a cheap place to stay. I think that was in Illinois. They happened upon a military barracks, and were told, "Stay here." My grandpa bunked with the soldiers, and my aunt got somewhat nicer quarters with military women where she apparently had curtains that separated her from the other ladies. Those were the days. Show up at a military building and be offered lodging. Number 3. The final story comes from my mom, who was born in 1936. She lived in a rough part of Fort Wayne near the GE plant. Now slated to become condos and mixed commercial and residential, and that's near railroad tracks. She and many other kids played on the tracks, probably barefoot, and would run into hobos. Something like traveling bums, or, if you want to be more politically correct, like the displaced or homeless. She knew a hobo. One day he took her on a tour of the tracks and showed her his crops. These were often corn, maize, plants that had sprouted from grain falling off the railroad cars. He told her, that one will be ready in 4 weeks, that other one in 2 months, and so on. He would roast the corn on fires, and I'm sure it was often dinner.
Pretty bad. Both of my parents went through the Depression. They remember going to bed hungry, living in cold flats, as they did not have the money for heat in the winter and washing up with cold water. They lived on relief from the government that gave them food. Dried beans, cheese, potatoes, and such. No meat. Things were bad for many years until the war came along and my father joined the U.S. Navy. He finally got a new pair of shoes and 3 hot meals a day. My mother worked in a war plant making walkie-talkies. So, yes. The Depression was bad. Very bad. Thank you for joining us. Make sure to subscribe and click the like button. When the stories run out, make sure to flip the tape over to continue. Adios, amigos.